Our next speaker is Chris Lewicki, who's an entrepreneur, engineer, and near futurist focused on the economic development of outer space, as many of us are. He's fascinated by exponential technologies, integrating ideas from disparate industries and creating space infrastructure upon which generations of progress can be made. He predicts that space infrastructure will extend beyond traditional concepts of technology and also include new economic systems and new mechanisms for governance of activities beyond Earth. He believes that the significant presence of humans in space will only be possible by sourcing raw materials from interplanetary space, including asteroids, the lunar surface, and Mars for construction, spacecraft fuel, and life support consumables. And I absolutely agree. So, Chris.
So I'm going to give a brief presentation today, which will probably raise more questions than answers that it provides. But my goal here is to reframe the way that we look at both space resources and their place in the space economy. Infrastructure is a key part of that, and it's something I kind of want to lead you through a discussion on today. And we grew up certainly surrounded by infrastructure. We look past it, and in a city scene like this, you see right to the horizon, and everything else is invisible to you. The infrastructure that we live with every day, we certainly take for granted, and there are parts of it that are hidden in plain sight, whether it's power distribution, communications, public utilities, or things that are maybe a little bit softer, like emergency services or banking or security, things like that. And with space infrastructure, we really have very little. More than 50 years and billions of dollars. I would point to these laser ranging retroreflectors as the only in-space infrastructure that we have. They were placed, actually, the last of which was placed 30 years ago Friday, or 50 years ago Friday by Apollo 15. And these are used to precisely measure the distance from the Earth to the moon. And they take no power. Any nation can use them. They require no maintenance, and they work just as good as the day they were deployed. So in a lot of ways, they're the perfect definition of infrastructure, if only there were much more of it. Certainly, there's a lot of buildings that we've built on Earth that have been serving the space industry reasonably well, but the hard part about creating a market is that in order to do that in space, you currently still need to bring nearly all of your infrastructure with you. So let's take a look at that. What is infrastructure? A simple definition is it's the foundation on which we build an economy. It's the things that we can kind of use as shared resources. It's often the things that our taxes pay for. And three main areas: hard infrastructure, soft infrastructure, and critical infrastructure. I think we're very familiar with hard infrastructure, certainly on Earth, roads, highways, bridges, those things that seem to need constant maintenance, and the things that we realize when they're not in good repair. We don't often think about the institutions that maintain our infrastructure, and in space we actually have, in many cases, well-developed institutions that help maintain order somewhat in space. And certainly there's a need for a lot more developed and I wouldn't say centralized, but knowing where to go for certain types of things and who is the reference bearer for standards and oversight. So soft infrastructure, we've got a great start on. But I think the one to highlight here is critical infrastructure, things that are just absolutely essential. And that's the definition of space systems. If it's not essential, it's usually not on your rocket or on your spacecraft or on your space station. And looking at those as a business opportunity or a way that your business can interact with other businesses, or a way perhaps where you can grow your business in a way that not only does it serve your own needs for your own market, but helps create new markets that you can collaborate with others where things weren't possible just from your own efforts. So this is a quote that I love from Back to the Future. I think this is at the end of the movie. And certainly just talking about how things are changing. We don't have roads in space, but there are a lot of concepts that roads build upon, rights of way, safe travel, monitored transport that kind of are in the concepts of roads. So we need to build space infrastructure that's appropriate for space. So where do we start? One thing that I would look at is, again, my definition of space infrastructure. What could we do in space so that if we fail, go out of business, or kind of changed by the decades, that infrastructure is still there. Infrastructure usually is measured in decades, not in quarters or years. And the International Space Station, I would say, is maybe just on the edge of either being infrastructure or not being infrastructure. Certainly, if we weren't taking care of it, it'd be gone in a few years just through orbital decay, if not through a number of other problems. And another big problem that we have with our investments in space thus far is it's not reasonable to expect that a startup or a small company could actually maintain and operate the space station. It's a piece of infrastructure that is kind of above the punching weight of most entities that would be out there. So maybe there's smaller parts of it that represent usable infrastructure. So what is likely that first infrastructure to be provided? And is it likely to be provided by the government? Another way to look at it is there infrastructure that's likely to be provided as a commercial service, perhaps to the government. And we look at launch and transportation services, transport of astronauts. Those are services. They aren't really infrastructure. So maybe something we can look forward to as we build out capability on the surface of the moon. You could certainly see that landing pads would be infrastructure. You could also look at emergency services where they're like bunkers where we could go from a solar flare, or rescue services kind of being a soft infrastructure. Those get to in-space infrastructure. But this underlying question is like, what could you build that, even if an era passes, it's still relevant? So I'll touch on that in a little bit. So as it goes to space resources and the space resource supply chain, certainly one idea that has come up and has been proposed is the Strategic Propellant Reserve. And there's a report there referenced on the bottom by the United States National Space Council user group that talks about the idea of a strategic propellant reserve, and a note at the end of that, kind of as an afterthought, that talks about space age water stops. And this would be something that both would be a customer for space resources and part of the supply chain for it. It's very likely that you'd co-locate it with other economic activity, whether that's R&D activity, tourist activity, manufacturing activity. This kind of makes sense to have destinations where these things are collected. And it's something that lends itself to a natural monopoly. Infrastructure often does. It doesn't make sense to have competing high voltage power lines and competing fire hydrants. And those things that we all depend on, it kind of makes sense to have one. That's not to say that, of course, the contract for implementing those can't be done by a private company or can't be done by multiple private companies in different areas and different jurisdictions. But this is an opportunity to build that infrastructure. And the Strategic Propellant Reserve, as an example, would probably initially be filled from terrestrial sources. But by doing that, it creates the idea of in-space refueling, starts to create architectures for it, starts to create markets, and really that expectation where I think, as Dr. Sowers had said, starts to linearize the exponential rocket equation. Another example I thought as I was looking at this water stop, which is a 100-year-old active water stop in West Virginia. This is an example of actually a split fuel system where the fuel is sitting there in the tender in the back of that train, and the oxidizer, so to speak, is in that water tower. So whether you're with a LOX methane system, a LOX hydrogen system, a metal system, the idea that you don't have to supply all of the constituents of the fuel in one place is something that is an idea that's 100 years old, and it adapts as the technology needs. And I think we can anticipate that type of flexibility in space. This is something that in a longer presentation I'd build out and discuss kind of the Venn diagram of these things. But a key question for, I think, a successful business and certainly a thriving economy is, what of your space resource infrastructure will be in common with space resources consumers who are using your resources to support other businesses? Things like GPS, position, navigation, and timing, data relay. I've mentioned landing pads. Joel has shared what will certainly be a need for megawatt power just to start on the moon and other places. So energy plants, both for production, distribution, and storage. Test facilities. We've got 0G test facilities. We've got 1G test facilities. And for a few seconds at a time, maybe a few minutes at a time, we can test things in between. So being able to test things on the way to the moon might be a business opportunity. Repair and failover is something that we build integral into our systems, but maybe this is, as Northrop Grumman is starting to show, something that we can have as an adjunct and as a business itself. As we get dozens of people and hundreds of people in space and private actors, we're probably going to have the need for rescue services. Rescue services where you don't, necessarily always bring your own parachute. So this is actually a good sign that people will be able to operate with less of a safety net. But that safety net will start to be an important soft infrastructure. I mentioned emergency shelters. Being able to be present on the moon is one thing. Being able to be survivable in all possible environmental conditions is another thing. And maybe that's something that the government should undertake in building, maybe uncomfortable, very small, but hardened structures that we know we can retreat to. And, don't have a flag or don't have a proprietary lock on the door to get into those places, so that we, again, have a social safety net, so to speak, on the moon and other places that we operate at. Another area in space where I think infrastructure will just be different than we're familiar with is in the virtual infrastructure, space traffic management, situational awareness, weather, traffic management, and things like maps, digital twins, knowing what the orbital debris is going to be, knowing what the meteoroid flux predicts are going to be, knowing when that transfer slot to or from your destination or maybe a docking port is scheduled to be available. These are all things that are going to represent infrastructure that's going to need to be created. And we're kind of haphazardly figuring these things right now on station, but we'll see a growing need for these. I think the most valuable question at all, and a takeaway for, like, if you can find this magic, you will be that 10 trillionaire in space, is how do you monetize your infrastructure as the business model itself? And AWS is a perfect example on this. Amazon doesn't make its money on Prime. They don't make its money necessarily on the margins in the store. They make their money on AWS, and AWS was a solution to their own problem that Jeff Bezos very smartly in the 2000s gave the direction to the company to make themselves a customer of their infrastructure so that that infrastructure can serve customers. So this is, I think, a paradigm change in the model that we've been serving space needs. Is we often lock ourselves into proprietary solutions or bespoke solutions for what is often a very, very difficult market need to fulfill that ends up being very customized. But if we can translate that to something where we have a generic solution that we can operate our own business. Think about, for example, it might be the equivalent of a space conference center where you have an arena, and that arena can host basketball games and sports. That arena can host trade shows. That arena can host conferences. It can host blood drives and vaccine drives. But the arena is the business model, and maybe sometimes you operate your own event in that arena. So this is kind of the model to think about and look for these business models that will start to come as we get more and more launch into space and we get more and more infrastructure in space. And this really is the type of business models that are going to allow every other business in space to grow. So that's the end of the thoughts that I wanted to share today. I'll keep them brief. And looking forward to feedback from folks. This is a new topic for me. I've created a Twitter account out there and have started using a hashtag space infrastructure. Follow Space Infobot, which is an automated Twitter bot that I've set up to help kind of give a channel for things that relate to space infrastructure. And while I'm focused mostly on the infrastructure that's in space when we get there, there's still a lot of it here on Earth that helps leverage our company and business as well. So thanks for your attention today, and looking forward to the panel discussion on all the great topics that we've heard today.
Thanks, Chris. This is a subject that's near and dear to my heart too, that I've been giving a lot of thought to over the last decade or so. And I'm glad to see that other people are thinking along the same lines.